Thank you very much, Dr. Adhikari. I must just clarify for my bio, just for my bio purposes, I'm not a fellow at CSD, so I don't know where you got that bio from, but it's all on my website. I teach politics and international relations. I'm an associate professor in that here, and have done for the last several years. And my work gender has been a consistent theme of what I work on over these last 2 decades, and across disciplines. So let me begin by saying that thank you very much for for host first of all for organizing this conference. My apologies for not having been able to listen to the sessions previously. There are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, there is the time difference, that in that I'm several hours behind you. And secondly, owing to reasons of my own personal health, I underwent major surgery last year, and I do have recurrent, unpredictable bouts of pain. And when I'm like that, I can't afford to take any risks with compromising on sleep. So that's one of the reasons that I wasn't. But from what I did here, I heard the last two papers, some of the last two papers on activist reflections and methodological reflections from fieldwork, and I found them to be extremely interesting, as were the list of many of the other papers that I had seen on your program. So my apologies if I end up repeating or sort of not knowing what has gone on before, and I look forward to the video. Okay, that being said, let me begin by talking about this topic, living gender. So I want to, I think, first of all, say that when we have a conference or an event or any kind of focus on thought, and we have that around gender, it is unsurprising that most often it is women, or people of other marginalized identities who are the people who have to take on that mantle. And this, I think, is reflective of two things. Firstly, that it is not just what gender means, but how gender means in our lived life, in our lived experiences. And secondly, the idea that it is the norm, as sociologists have often pointed out, passes off as unmarked, as something that is not deserving of reflection, because it is seen as the norm. So that when people talk about caste, they in effect often do not talk about Brahmanism, and the oppressions relating to caste oppression. They talk about it as if it is only the responsibility of those who are marginalized and who are at the receiving end of oppression to have to talk about it. But indeed, it is vital that not just women, but people who have privilege reflect upon it, whether it is of gender, of caste, or of other kinds of nation statist privileges. And therefore, if I start to unpack a word as naughty as gender, then it's relating to at least four things that I would like to sort of highlight. Firstly, claims making. Secondly, identity. Thirdly, power. And fourthly, agency. Now, what I mean by this, and I will over the course of the next sorry, I'm on a different time zone than you. So yeah, next half an hour or so, I will, over the course of the next half an hour, I will take you through some of the themes that I have worked on that I think are salient. So, for instance, in whether it's a social science discipline, or whether it's our lived life, or whether it's the politics that surrounds us, the idea of claims making is deeply tied into how regulatory regimes function. So that what does it mean to say that one is a woman? What does it mean to say that one is a Black person, or a disabled person, or or a Dalit person, or indeed a white person, and so on? So the idea of claims making in the public domain is tied to how regulatory regimes function, and within that context, the idea of the point about agency and is linked to the idea of politics, in that our feminist work over the last sort of especially the last several decades since the late 20th century has revealed to us the many ways in which agency is not something that is prior to politics. but that is constructed in and through our political engagements. One of the key, I guess, points of emphasis in my reflections here would be to say that there isn't and shouldn't be a place for essentialist ideas of identity, and of how that, and to highlight how that leads to a very problematic identity politics. I will unpack this, shortly. But the idea that we are not, it's gender is not about embodied women only. It is about embodied women, but it's not just about the idea of women per se. And the reason for that is because gender is fundamentally, as work of feminists globally over a long period of time has shown us, gender is fundamentally linked to power. And this was my third point. Gender is fundamentally linked to power in terms of how it functions, and therefore oppression carries within it an aspect of feminization. Through some examples I will go on to later illustrate this, but oppression is part of how oppression functions is by feminizing the subjugated. So therefore these terms that, how do we make claims in the public domain? What are the ways in which agency and politics are related? What does it mean to claim a certain identity? And the ways in which gender is connected to power are sort of the kind of broad themes that give us a sense that gender is something that is not just about embodiment, although it is also about embodiment. To inhabit this world as a non-norm individual, embodied individual, which is to say Black, brown, disabled, Asian, queer, etc., is to be circumscribed in the sorts of claims one can make, in the ways in which one is interpellated into situations of conflict, in the semiotic weight that is assigned to one's identity, and in the ways in which one experiences the sharp end of power. So therefore that terrain of circumscription is present, although of course it will systematically be present, but it will also be variable depending on which individuals we are talking about. So I guess the first big point that I want to the first main point that I want to make is that gender isn't just about women. That caste isn't just about Dalits, that race isn't just about Black people. This is the point about understanding this is to understand the relationality here, that you do not get to take the a phrase from a critical theorist Michael Shapiro's phrase, insurrectional textuality, that the way we use language matters, so that people aren't poor, they're impoverished, and they're impoverished because they are people who are affluent, and they are both two ends of a process. And that relationality and processuality can also be visible when we think about how people are not slaves, but they are enslaved, how people are not from colonies, but they are colonized. So that processual element and that relationality is important to understand how power functions in a way that it isn't just about, of course, the fundamental site of intervention has to be where the subjugation takes place, but that equally means understanding the supremacisms and the hierarchy and the kind of privileged positions that enable that to continue. So that's sort of like my first thing that I want to say. Moving on from that, the second sort of broad point that I want to say, which I think, based upon reflections over the years through my work in economics and through, and politics and Kashmir and other things, and, specifically as somebody who's concerned very much with the ways in which legal and social and political structures function to create marginalization, I want to refer you to the idea of the problems of binarisms in thinking, so that when we think of a binary, like, and this kind of, by the way, also connects to my previous point about the feminization in the hierarchy. So when we think about a binary like man woman, it isn't surprising, although it sort of should be, how that also neatly maps into other binaries such as West non-West, reason, emotion, science, nature, um, and so on. So the very fact that all of these different terms in these different binaries do not variably fall on one or the other side. In fact, most people would see that there is a privileged side of that binary, and then there is a less privileged side of that binary, whether it's black, white, reason, emotion, etc. So that one aspect of that binary is valorized and is taken as the norm. And that this is again not something that exists out there on its own, but it's part of of what post-colonial, decolonial, and other scholars and feminist scholars have pointed out, is part of a social cognitive process of othering, through which that other, that lack or that difference is constructed. But not all differences are the same, of course, as the critical race theorist Mary Matsuda points out, that in any dyadic relationship, if there isn't a kind of, if there isn't a power hierarchy, then both sides are seen as different. However, if there is a power hierarchy, then one of those sides of that binary will be seen as the norm, and the other will be seen as that which is abnormal or different or lacking. So the point that I want to make here really is to reflect upon the many ways in which our socio-cognitive processes constantly reinforce the hierarchy of what is normal, and how that then ties into various kinds of oppressions. So, whether that be heteronormativity, andronormativity, the idea that unless something is specified, it is male. Unless something is specified as being non-white, it is white. Or unless something is in another context, unless something is specified as being different ethnically or in religious terms, then it is the norm. But what that kind of binary sort of thinking enables is an inability to perceive the specificity and the contingency of that which passes for the norm. And that is, and that's, as I said, manifest in different ways. But this issue of binary thinking and how prevalent it is in our conceptualization is important when we try to understand gender as a lived experience. Now, so essentialisms around gender identity are problematic. Thirdly, I guess the point about both material and symbolic issues being of relevance does not need should not need as much stating as it often does, because there seems to be an understanding often that people have that there is action and then there is thought. But of course these two are interlinked, in that there isn't feminist theory and feminist activism, for instance, are both parts of that same process, because we do not have an unmediated access to the materiality of the world. Conceptual frameworks matter. Intersectionality matters. How various kinds of markednesses overlap in an individual identity matter. And some of these things are not even just they're not a legacy of the past. They are not things that just keep getting better, even in legal or even in sort of legal framework senses. In multiple countries, one sees ever more regressive laws. So there isn't a kind of a linear process forward in that we just keep generating better understandings and keep getting arriving to more emancipatory notions of existence. It isn't really that. In that there are many reversals. One of the problems, I think, with technology, with seeing technology as a panacea, is that we go from a world where, for us, let's say for a woman, if you look around, a world where judges, lawyers, doctors, etc., and so many people in society that hold positions of power happen to be men, or happen to be, well, there is a point about feminization, but I'll get to it shortly, happen to be men. Let's just take this at surface level right now. Happen to be men, but also that there is then a thing with technology, even in that all of these devices that are supposed to help us. Alexa is a woman. There are all these, kind of feminized service technologies of the future that are very kind of in a very deep sort of fundamental sense see and position women and that which is the feminine or feminized as the givers of care. In the last few years, I mean, the work on misogyny has been extremely revealing in this sense that, that patriarchy and misogyny are, as Kate Mann argued in her book, The Logic of Misogyny, patriarchy and misogyny are not the same thing. They are related, but they're not the same thing. In that misogyny is sort of like the policing branch of patriarchy, in that if women fail to deliver the goods that patriarchal societies require of them, then misogyny kicks into play by delegitimizing those women, be that through abuse or violence or or several other kinds of exclusions. So and this misogyny is not something that that happens just in one place or in one part of the world, as Me Too and various other things globally have shown us. This is something that is inherently a part of a culture of toxic masculinity that, of course, hurts both embodied men and women, and and any and all genders. So moving on to the sort of the next, having said that, moving on to the next part. And by the way, the fact that I'm focusing on looking at these imaginaries, looking at the ways in which this functions, does not mean that, I'm taking for granted that we understand that the violence against women as embodied women is real, fundamental and prevalent, and that there need to be and that there are individual, interpersonal, institutional, ideological components of it. So that empirical fact is, of course, there. But what I'm trying to do, I think, is conceptually also link it to other kinds of marginalizations and how power functions in a complex manner through those processes. So that we don't actually rely upon any simplistic understanding that in order to deal with this, if we just had more women in these positions, or if we just had this legislation, then things would be okay, because our experience of modernity, post-coloniality, and various kinds of empowerment has shown us that truly emancipation is not a simple matter, that understanding the oppressions that are carried out in the name of unmarked identities are not straightforward. So moving on to sort of the next broad point that I want to make as part of as part of urging us to think decolonially and anti-colonially, and in ways that are better for everyone, is to say that, so gender is a relationship of power, I was arguing. So recognition matters, representation matters, repression exists, as you know, because you've been hearing papers on all of these things. Let me bring another R into this, and then there is, in the face of all of this, there is resistance. And what are the ways in which that resistance can play a role in how we live gender, right? And so firstly, that resistance is and ought to be about thinking of the relationship between knowledge and the identity or difference. And I use the terms identity or difference, and this goes back a long time. If you wish to read further, Imagining Economics Otherwise, there's a kind of whole theorization of identity problematics in my first book. So the idea of knowledge, how we resist, is that we resist by rethinking the ways in which knowledge has been handed down to us, and who is seen as the valid subject of that knowledge, whose representations do those knowledge schemas, whose lives do they mirror, whose concerns do they reflect. And that's important because in an epistemological sense, the idea simply that there is a kind of abstract body of knowledge that is that's just carried, that's just the sign of the human, some abstract individual who's ungendered, asexed, non-located, is problematic. Because if we take that as a given, then we adopt very simplistic empiricist ideas of epistemology, through wherein things could be made better if we just had more people of a certain identity in a certain context. Important, will not solve the problem, will not per se in and of itself mean anything, may not any in any fundamental sense mean anything, which is why you have women who can lead regimes that who can be part of political parties, who can be in governments that enact fundamentally anti-women measures. And which is why people somehow use that, turn that around. And then you have the phenomenon of tokenism, where you have somebody saying, well, look, here is this person of a marginalized identity, and what they are telling us is that all of your struggles are delegitimized because, look, they share your identity and they don't think like you. That is a problem because it relies upon a very simplistic idea of of an empiricist epistemology, where making knowledge better and more reflective of difference is just to bring sort of these different kinds of bodies into that knowledge mix, which hasn't worked, doesn't work, and is of course open to all kinds of problematics through some of the examples that I gave you, but I'm sure you can think of many others. Moving on from that, how then can we think of knowledge, the relationship of knowledge and identity and difference? Well, we think of that as feminist work over time has shown us, through an idea of standpoint epistemology, that we do not take just identities. It doesn't simply mean that because you are a woman, you will somehow be, or because you are disabled, or because you are brown or black or whatever, that you will somehow you will somehow be reflective of marginalized knowledges. However, that particular positionality and that particular identity does give you the ability to have access to perspectival and situated knowledges. However, that is the work. That is a work and a process. It's not something that you are biologically simply born with and you've just inherited it because of how you look, or your birth boundary or whatever. So standpoint requires us to reflect. Standpoint epistemology requires us to reflect and think about the ways in which people's standpoints, which are, to quote a famous line, it's not an inheritance, it's not a given, it's something that you work on, how those standpoints matter and why we should pay attention to them. And then further on, there is the post-structuralist epistemological sense, which is what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about gender as power, in that we move from a simplistic notion of identity politics, where people simply carry their kind of embodied identities and the relevant politics connected to that, relevant emancipatory politics connected to that, to the move from that to a politics of identity, where all identities, and not just those that are seen as lacking, different, marginalized, etc., are seen as contingent, constructed, and political. And that means that it's not just the Muslims, it's not just the Dalits, it's not just the women, it's not just the disabled or the formerly colonized people or whatever, that are the only ones that are different or other or whatever. All identities have a politics associated with them, and that again brings us back to the way in which power has a relationality. So resisting in terms of knowledge means paying attention to these sorts of questions. Resisting, then secondly, in terms of the idea of how bodies function, mean, I don't even have to say this, one of the papers that somebody was just talking about refers to all of this, but the ways in which specific kinds of bodies are subjected to power, and why it is still so powerful for a woman to say, Mera jism meri marzi, or me too, or for the ways in which the kind of the social structures, the matrices of society that we inhabit, still within those matrices, the autonomy of the bodies for specific kinds of bodies is still such a struggle. The third so knowledge is bodies, histories and memories. Now, what I mean by this is firstly to acknowledge things like feminist thinking, gender, thinking about gender, thinking about freedoms is not the unique inheritance of any specific kinds of people in any specific parts of the world, which is to say these are not specifically modern things, they are not specifically Western things, and equally there isn't a sort of given way in which nativist understandings of these are somehow always purer and better. that regressive and progressive ideas of gender can fall on any or all sides of the globe, and that these memories, and that that the human capacity for oppression is globally distributed in a kind of fairly democratic way, that there is violence everywhere. It may take different forms in the West or the non-West, in the center or the peripheries of nation states. However, there is nothing sort of liberatory and modern about any one specific given identity, be that of of a white Christian European 100 years ago, or a Hindu Indian male now, or or someone else from some other part of the world. There isn't a there's nothing given about these histories and memories. That witnessing is a constant act, and that we have, and there's just so much valuable work that has been done and that needs to continue to be done to uncover the histories of the past, of as of all the anonymous figures in history that have been women. And even today, when even in pretty much any discipline, ranging from science to meteorology to sociology to economics, there's a handful of people who will actually know all of these important figures and founders and people who've co-authored books, including credited people, who are not people will know about John Stuart Mill, but not about Harriet Taylor Mill, and so on and so forth. But all of these figures, there is no such thing as these there is no such thing except as an invention of this specific history of men throughout history, or of privileged people throughout history who have been uniquely enlightened. It really isn't the case. The histories are multiple, and many of them continue to be excavated as we go along. The next point, the sort of the next point about resistance that I want to make relates to nations. And again, here, the idea that the work on gender and nation is tremendously significant. The idea that women and property and are seen as it's the duty of men in the service of the nation to protect the women and property is fundamentally global, in one way or the other. If you look at the ways in which militaries work, if you look at the ways in which sort of the kind of macho instruments of power and weaponry and ideas of national prestige function, that it works right from the level of the nuclear arsenal to the level of the border war, to the level of just somebody saying, well, what business have women protesting on the streets? They should go home. So this idea of who defines the boundary of resistance when it comes to the nation, and when it comes to the sort of the real business of the nation, around territoriality, around rights. And women have always been part of this, but there is a kind of a long running history of denying women that space, and of looking at women instead as somehow secondary beings whose issues and rights can somehow not be can be addressed at some point later on. So for instance, the relationship between women and women's issues, women's struggles and anti-colonial struggles reflects this so much. Where and including in the present, actually, where in terms of in situations of conflict or resistance struggles, women's issues are seen as secondary, and this just works. It works in a way that's kind of like the lampshade effect. It's in public view, and somehow yet people still think that this is not problematic. Now let me come to something quite specifically, and this is has been the mainstay of a lot of my work over my life. I have, I think at this point, perhaps a personal note. So I did my master's in the late 90s, and maybe about 20 years ago, around that time, that I was doing my PhD on and feminist epistemology was a big part of that, looking at, and feminist economics, and raising these questions of, we were raising these questions, and in my work too, about, whose interests do these knowledges serve, and thinking about things like, just, it isn't simply the case that that women having property will make their lives easier. In fact, women having property, if they are already vulnerable, probably makes them more targeted. So there are lots of counterintuitive ways in which identity matters, right? And then over time, and again, going back to my work on politics and international relations, going back over time, this idea of gender and coloniality for me has been significant in looking at the parallels, the sort of similarities between how colonizations and gender oppressions function. So Kashmir has been, I'm of course, you know my, I mean, you will know perhaps, I mean, if not, then I will tell you. Kashmir is a kind of a main focus of my thought, and not just Kashmir, but as a place, as a conflicted place like Kashmir, those kinds of parallels of we will civilize you go back in history, and they also are geographically prevalent. So this idea that people can be modernized, developed, etc., and civilized against their will, is so colonial, and yet it is also so gendered in how those are precisely the sorts of logics used to deny rights in history. So on August the 5th, 2019, when the autonomy and statehood was revoked, the two fundamental things that I have since then, I mean, I think it's impossible to miss them, but it's certainly something that in my congressional hearing too I brought up. The two fundamental points are around consent and dissent, right? So what does that tell us? The idea, who is it that whose consent is not sought? Who is it who is not allowed to express dissent? And how does that subject position link to feminization? I mean, you cannot, the idea that you have to do this, whether you're consenting to this or not, is something that we know. Those of us who are feminists, or who are, whether men, women, or any other gender, or who are women, know this, right? The denial of consent is so fundamentally a gendered move, a move of gender as power, as a move that feminizes. When you say, well, you are not allowed to resist, that is again one of those very fundamentally gendered moves. So prior to this, in my earlier work, and this is a paper in Feminist Review, I looked at how the idea of Kashmir and Indian logics in Kashmir, sorry, not logics, extra logical. A lot of the action is extra logical, because, to use Lauren Berlant's phrase, it's cruel optimism. It's not something that necessarily even serves the interests of the people in whose name it's carried out. But that, though they reflect, it's not just about, so when we look at gender in that context, it's not just about Kashmiri women. It's not just about women who are the victims of, enforced disappearances or mass rapes or violence, sexual violence in conflict zones, or just that state of precarity. That is, of course, all there, and that is important. However, beyond that, how this functions, how this legitimizes itself, is through representation, of the other as either exotic or barbaric. This again goes back to that idea of the Orientalist imaginary of the other, that socio-cognitive process I began speaking to you about. Secondly, through this representation of Kashmir as this fundamental other. Secondly, through the process of cartography. Here I'm again linking back to, say, work like Cynthia and Lo and others around the globe. This idea of of why is it so problematic that, if Nivedita Menon shows a map of the country of India upside down, why is that so problematic? Why is it so troubling? Why is there this kind of this cartographic anxiety that manifests itself in this way? And partly this logic of it being the head of Mother India, and of, again, mother, the idea of sacrificing to the mother, and the mother being the nation, and the male sons of the nation are seen as sort of, the valid people who have to do that sacrifice in the interests of the women and property. So this idea, these imaginaries, I mean, I can't go into great detail here, but this is all part of published work over time, so you can find it if you wish. But this idea of this cartographic idea of the country, of its head, of the mother country, and of what sacrifice. And yet at the same time, this is also accompanied by a logic where certain kinds of mothers and certain kinds of motherhoods is validated, is valuable, is used as as an exemplar, and yet other kinds of mothers and their suffering is not seen within the same spectrum. Thirdly, representation, cartography, and possession, and discourses of possession that see relationships. And I'm certainly not the first person to be saying this, but you can find work. Uma Chakravarti, for instance, Nandita Haksar, other people have said this idea of looking at this as a marital union, and to say, well, this is a husband and a wife thing, that, I'm not really not making this up, of course. There are people who actually have argued for looking at Kashmir as kind of like this petulant mistress who just needs, or a wife who needs subduing and attention. And that, that the whole gendered logics of that kind of imaginary of somebody who's in the heading the police forces, to actually say, well, you beat your wife and therefore you have to occasionally be cruel to people in unjustified ways. So this kind of these logics of representation, cartography, and possession play a deep role in feminizing a territory. And when I say feminizing a territory, this was my other point, when I said there's a surface level of looking at gender as just women, but then the feminization as a process that is not even just about embodiment. It's about it's a process that creates a certain functioning of power, and in this case, it is the territory and the landscape that gets feminized. In this way, by being represented as exotic, by being represented as this head, by being represented as a possession, as a to quote Shah Rukh Khan in Kashmir, it's like that Kaka Kiran thing. It's it's KK Kashmir thing. So therefore, when I as people in India who are thinking about gender, it is vital to think about the ways in which men saying, now we can marry fair-skinned Kashmiri women, is a scar on the, to use a famous phrase, as a scar on the collective conscience of a nation, for men to say, well, now we can go and marry their women. This is as literally as colonial as you can get. And at the same time, for this to be accompanied by a contradictory logic in that, well, we're developing them, we're modernizing them, they oppress their women, and we have to liberate their women. How's that different from, from the many ways in which such logic has been used by imperial powers throughout history, be that British India, be that US Afghanistan, be that China in Xinjiang, talking about, kind of civilizing the Uyghur women. So my point here is that the idea of politics, therefore, is fundamentally, in this sense at least, constructed on the bodies of women, that of liberating or possessing women, and the ways in which these logics get appropriated. So I hope that one of the things that I realized that when I started out, there were and over the course of this talk, I've referred to several things, and perhaps it seems like there isn't a time kind of thread, but there is, and I will finish by emphasizing what those key points that I want you, especially if those of you who are students or who are thinking about these questions and topics. There are, there's a galaxy of work out there. So as we think through these things, the question of the idea of building alliances, solidarities, and acknowledging the work that has come before is deeply crucial. It is also important for anyone who thinks about marginality to think and reflect about the sorts of oppressions that are carried out in their name, because all of us are simultaneously, in certain contexts, either privileged or marginalized, and are intersectionally vulnerable in different situations. And therefore, it becomes sort of like a kind of an ethical responsibility as scholars, as activists, as students, to think about these things. Now, overall, the reflections, in point form, that I want to leave you with is, firstly, gender is not just about women. Women, feminine, and feminize are not the same thing. gender as a relationship of power has functioned in multiple ways, in complex ways, to feminize that identity, collectivity, context, which is sought to be subjugated or oppressed. That's sort of like the first thing I want to leave you with. Secondly, binary thinking and essentialisms are problematic. They are also deeply entrenched in how we relate to the world and to each other. Nonetheless, they are problematic, and that the way to circumvent them, to challenge them, is not to uncritically valorize the other side of the binary. That when that happens, then you say all people of all men are evil and all women are good, or all Western people are problematic and all whatever are all formerly colonized people are good. That just leads to various kinds of unquestioning regressivisms. Thirdly, that the resistance to thinking about, to living gender differently, the matter of resistance is multifaceted. It involves resistance in the domains of knowledge, where we do not accept a simple idea of identity politics, where we do accept that situated knowledges and embodied identities matter, but not in any simplistic way that we are interpolated into society in different roles. Knowledges, bodies, memories, and histories, and especially the way in which all of that links to the idea of nations and nationalisms. And finally, to just really reflect about the injustices in the present, including those that it might be hardest to articulate. That it's relatively easy to talk about. I think George Orwell, I think, said, journalism is something that someone doesn't want to be, want you to. Journalism is doing something that someone doesn't want you to print. Everything else is media, no, public relations. Everything else is public relations. So speaking at a I just also, it's just coincidentally and serendipitously hit me that this is a media college. So speaking as a media college, I mean, oh my god, you guys are, if people listening to this are media students, you're the ones who make those representations happen literally every single day. And there's just so much that needs to be done to undo. I mean, the whole point about where globally societies are sliding into various kinds of totalitarianisms and proto-fascisms is how critical thinking in the public sphere is getting diminished by the day. So as people who are part of the media world, of the business of making things real through the use of words, it is really important to reflect not just upon the easy things that you can be critical about, but also to sort of push the boundaries of critical thinking, to actually really ask, who is this working for? What, in whose name are these oppressions carried out? How can we know better? Because remember agnotology, Proctor's term, the idea that the sustained manufacture and maintenance of ignorance is powerful. It is literally the most powerful tool that can be used to propagate this, to perpetuate the status quo. Therefore, it is really important to kind of question the sustained and deliberate indifference and ignorance that we are often inculcated into taking as given and as unquestionable. That there are these questions of security for whom, and I say this specifically as somebody who's very concerned about injustices. Of course, you will know that on Kashmir, but also globally, the ways in which the us versus them thing, and the idea that human rights and gender rights and all of this and queer rights and all of these things are somehow Western. How come? I mean, how does it even square that that former colonial powers are the inheritors and the originators of human rights, and not, and that this is not a global struggle? So it is really important, and I urge you to keep this in your mind as you think about how power works, how feminization works to subjugate people of any and all kinds of marginalized intersectional identities, both individually and in collectivities. Thank you.